Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Joe, as well. Again, all those names. Great reading. Now, if you were trying to track along in chapters 9 and 10 there, we didn't read it all, as you would have noticed. And we jumped from sort of verse 10 in chapter 9 to 20 to 22, and then to 10 verse 3, to try and kind of encapsulate some of the key things in the story. Oh, I've been asked to look at this camera. As we reflect on this story today, I want us to draw out a few things. I want us to bring the story into land, but I want us also to reflect on the character of Mordecai, on a key question he asks in the story, and on the hidden hinge moment in the whole thing, and what that has to teach us today. Because you see, it's an incredible story. It's a story for the ages. It's a story for our age and our time today. I was listening this morning to a worship song by a band called Maverick City Music called Remember. And the lines in the song went like this. It said, "We remember, we won't forget how he took my life from the pit. Now look where we are now. Look at where we were back then." And as we arrive at the end of this story, and we read verses like I'm about to read in a moment, it must have been moments where Esther and Mordecai could have echoed a similar worship song. Look at where we are now. Look at where we were back then. So look at this. Let's start with Mordecai. Verse 3 of chapter 10. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. If you've been tracking with the story, that is the most extraordinary turnaround. God lifting him up from the pit, so to speak. Look at where he is now. The people of God, the Jews, read with me chapter 9, and verse 22. As the time when the Jews I'll read from verse 20 so it makes a bit more sense. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, that they should celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. You compare that, if you turn back the page, with chapter 4, when Mordecai goes to Esther, and we'll look back at these verses a little bit more later. But he says this in verses 12 to 14. When Esther's words were reported back to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews," the thing they're celebrating in chapter 9, relief and deliverance for the Jews, "will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Look at where we are now. Look at where we were then. It is the most extraordinary story. And it's interesting to me that the time period between when the dice were rolled, seemingly condemning the Jews to their fate, and where we are now is actually a little under a year. We are a little under a year from when we went into our first lockdown. And I wonder what this year has been like for you. I expect for most of us, not just those of us who've been homeschooling, but we've heard about Julie this morning, and there were lots of names on my lips as we were thinking about those who might be feeling particularly acute loss on Valentine's Day. For many of us, there is still grief that is to turn to joy. But whatever your circumstance and whatever your situation, whatever your year has been like, whatever the future looks like, we can trust in the hidden hand of God, and that he is always working for the good of those who love him. And there might be some stuff to put in the mystery box if you've been tracking with the story and with the teaching over the last few weeks. But my prayer for all of us, my firm belief for all of us and for our church, is that one day and one day soon, our sorrow will be turned to joy and our mourning into a day of celebration. That there will be feasting and joy and gatherings and celebration, and we will be able to praise God for where we are now compared to where we were then. God is still at work, and he is building his church. The story, if you follow along the narrative in chapter 9, just very briefly to summarize it, forgive me for not going through it step by step, read it yourself and finish off the story in your homes. But we see the tables have well and truly turned. Mordecai has become prominent in his palace, verse 4. His reputation has spread across through the provinces. He's become more and more powerful. The Jews are able to defend themselves against their enemies. There's bloodshed in this chapter, but do notice that they actually only attack, they're only defending themselves against those who are attacking them. And actually, interestingly, they don't go as far as they could. They're told they can plunder their enemies, but 3 times in this chapter, in chapter 9, in verse 10, in verse 15, in verse 16, we're told that they do not lay their hands on the plunder. It's just an interesting note. And for those of you who really remember back to the first week and want to get underneath the story, I wonder if there's a hint back here to the ancient history, the animosity between the Agagites, or the tribe that Haman was from, and the tribe that Mordecai was from. You might remember that their ancestors were King Agag for Haman and King Saul for Mordecai, who had a battle. And where King Saul got it wrong was in wiping out his enemy, he did allow some of his men to plunder King Agag and his people. I wonder whether there's an acknowledgement in these Jews here, in this story, of going, we're not going to make that mistake again, where God had told them not to do it. So there is some restraint as well in the story. But the tables are turned, the battle is won, the Jews are given victory, there is feasting and joy, and there's a new festival that is celebrated, that comes into the Jewish calendar, that is celebrated to this day, just as it's highlighted in verses 20 to 22. The same thing happens today. I did a bit of research into it. The same thing happens today. The festival of Purim is still celebrated amongst the Jewish people. It's been handed down all these years. It's an amazing story. But for the rest of our time this morning, I want us to try and draw some lessons out of a character, a question, and the hinge of history in this story. First of all, the character. We could go with Esther. I'm going to go with Mordecai. For my money, actually, Mordecai is as much, if not a greater hero in the story than Esther. The story finishes with Mordecai describing his position. And do have a look with me at his character. So when we read in verse 3 that he's been raised to this position of significant power, how does he use his power? Well, he uses his power because he works in this way. He worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Compare that with how Haman used his power. Right at the back in chapter 3, the start of chapter 3, it says this: after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor, higher than that of all the other nobles, just like Mordecai at the end of the story. Except how does he use his power? All the royal officials and the king's gates knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. So Haman uses his power and his position to serve himself. Mordecai uses his power and his position to serve others. I long that in our church and in this nation, more and more Christians, believers, might be raised up to positions of influence and authority in our community. I'm so grateful that our own Member of Parliament, Michael Tomlinson, follows Jesus. We long that we would have public servants with the character and convictions and longing for justice that Mordecai exhibits, and the way he serves the Jews, the welfare of the city, like Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach served the welfare of the city, the peace and prosperity of the city in exile. I long for that. I'd love us to be a church that isn't measured necessarily by the number of great preachers we have, though we do have a whole number of great preachers. But actually the number of people in the public sphere, the key workers, and the people making a difference in our communities for the gospel. I'd love us to be a church that's measured not by the number of people we can gather in a church, which not many at the moment, but hopefully, again, in the future, quite a number. But I'd love us to be measured not by that, but by the number of people we send into our communities to be people of influence and transformation in our communities. I love the character of Mordecai. He shows humility. He shows humility at multiple points in the story, where he recognizes that he can't and only God can. When he mourns and cries out to God at the edict at the start of chapter 4, you could look back. He puts on sackcloth and ashes and goes out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. He begins, you'll remember us saying at the end of week 2, in that place of prayer. That's where we have to begin. There are moments for action, but they begin in the place of prayer. He's humble. He's prayerful. He has character and integrity. He has compassion. He's stirred for the injustice that the Jews are about to face. I wonder what you are stirred for at this time. Yesterday morning, quite rare for me, but I was on diocesan synod, and I somehow stumbled into leading the opening worship at diocesan synod. I don't know quite how that happened, but there I was. I had to do it. But the highlight was definitely not my opening worship. The highlight was right near the end. A young guy, 17, called Joe Brindle, speaking up passionately for climate care and his activity in that department, all that he'd been doing. He referenced an important piece of research that Tear Fund and Youthscape released just this week about what young people in church are most passionate about. Do you know what? 9 out of 10 young people, the things they are most passionate about are discrimination and the environment. And do you know what? Of those same young people that were polled, only 1 out of 10 of them think their church are doing enough. 9 out of 10. The thing that most moves them and that they're most passionate about today are injustices, discrimination like racism or homophobia. And the thing that they're most passionate about as well is the environment, is climate care. And yet only 1 in 10 of them think their church is doing enough. What is it that God stirs your heart for, that makes you weep and put on sackcloth and ashes? And if there's nothing, why is there nothing? You see, when we get close to the heart of God and we see some of the crises that our world are facing, not just the pandemic, but before the pandemic, the people of God should be moved, brokenhearted for the state of the world, and moved to prayer. The character of Mordecai, a key question. This question still kind of haunts me in a certain sense. I apply it to my life. Maybe some of you who have been called to stand for different things at this time. I apply it to our church as well, to the church in this nation. So read with me chapter 4 and verses 12 to 14 again. Well, we'll just go with 14. You know the context. We read it earlier. Well, Mordecai says, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. We are not to remain isolated away in our secure homes and our secure, safe churches." Beth talked about us needing to stand up and be dangerous for the enemy. Verse 14, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Do you know, as we begin, I hope, to emerge in some way from this pandemic, or the crisis of this pandemic soon, how will you re-emerge? Next week, we start a new sermon series in Ezra and Nehemiah we're calling Renew, as we look at the people of God returning from exile to Jerusalem. They return and they rebuild and they re-envision, they renew. What is going to be a return for you and what is going to be new for you? What do you need to repent of and lay down? What new things do you need to pick up if you're going to be obedient to God? And for us as a church, we've been incredibly blessed through this season. I know from Dawson Synod and other things that I've been on that there are a lot of churches and a lot of church leaders out there who are really struggling. Really struggling. It's a crisis that in many ways the church in this nation is facing. But of course also it's an opportunity if we will listen, if we will stand up, if we will not remain silent at this time. Because the church of Jesus Christ, God will build. Jesus will build his church. The question is, will we be part of that? Will we at this time stand up and be taken note of? Will we at this time, as our church, renew? Because things have changed in our world, and things have changed, accelerated in some ways, and not great ways, in the church in this nation. I have absolute confidence that Jesus will build his church. The question is, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance, the church will grow despite you. But the question is, will you be part of it? Will we be part of it? God needs to renew his church. We need to learn the lessons around this time if we're going to be a church that loves Jesus and lives out that love in the world, that reaches the lost, that grows the found, that transforms our community. A character, a question. The hinge. The hidden hinge of the whole story. When we look at this story, there are loads of moments we could look at and just go, that's incredible. The turnaround of that moment. It could be when Esther goes to the king. She says, if I perish, I perish. And she goes to the king. That could be the hinge moment. Hinge moment could be the second banquet that she throws. By the way, have you noticed how much food and how much banqueting there is in this chat? I think that's another reason I love this book. Lots of food. But it could be that second banquet that we look at. But for me, for my money, the hidden hinge are the prayers of God's people. That's what activates the move of God in this story. Mordecai recognizes that. He helps inspire Esther to that. Esther and Mordecai together inspire the people of God to that. It's in prayer. It's the hidden hinge of history, isn't it? Is the activity of God. So yes, we have to work with God and have these moments of courage and obedience like Mordecai and Esther do, showing integrity and character. But they all begin in the place of prayer, the place of humility, the place of desperation, the place of hunger, the place of listening to the voice of God and then being obedient to what he says. We as a church have an opportunity on Thursday of this week to give 24 hours to prayer. You might not do 24 hours straight, but a day to prayer and fasting as a parish. And I read this, or rather, Michelle read this last night. This is the book, My Utmost for His Highest, by Oswald Chambers. Many of you will know it. And before bed, Michelle read, this is like her daily devotional before she goes to sleep. And she read this to both of us yesterday evening, or I'm going to read some extracts from it. And this is what it says. Have I disobeyed some command of my Lord's this week? If I'd realized that it was a command of Jesus, I would not have deliberately disobeyed it. But most of us show incredible disrespect to God because we don't even hear him. It might as well be that he'd never spoken to us. The goal of my spiritual life is such close identification with Jesus Christ that I will always hear God and know that God hears me. If I am united with Jesus Christ, I hear God all the time through the devotion of hearing. What hinders me from hearing is my attention to other things. It's not that I don't want to hear God, but I'm not devoted in the right areas of my life. I'm devoted to things and even to service and my own convictions. God may say whatever he wants, but I just don't hear him. The attitude of a child of God should always be, speak, for your servant hears. If I've not developed and nurtured this devotion of hearing, I can only hear God's voice at certain times. At other times, I become deaf to him because my attention is to other things, things which I think I must do. This is not living the life of a child of God. Have you heard God's voice today? Friends, it all begins. There's characters like Mordecai that we learn. There's questions and moments that are really important in the story. But the hinge of the story is in prayer. Have you heard the voice of God for your life recently? For our church? Are you distracted by other things, like me a lot of the time? Are you devoted in the right areas or the wrong areas of your life? Church, it is so important that we pray, that we listen intently to God, that we nurture and practice the devotion of hearing before we try and step out in obedience and courage, before we try and become the people of God that his Spirit is refining in us. Would you join me in prayer this Thursday? I'm so grateful that so many of you do. It's not like this is our only time of prayer or only opportunity. But for such a time as this, in our church, in our parish, in your life, in this nation, we need to pray. And we need to pray not just for the things that we need to see happen in the world, but as I was reminded by Beth yesterday evening, we need to pray too just because we love Jesus and we want to be with him. And I don't know about you, but I've had my ups and downs in this last nearly year. Times where I felt further or closer to Jesus. But I need to pray this Thursday just because I need to reactivate more of the love of Jesus and the enjoyment of his presence and the hearing of his voice. I need to pray, yes, because I have prayers I want him to answer, but I need to pray because I love him. And I want to love him more. And I long that we would be a church that love him and want to love him more and want to hear his voice and want to see his kingdom come and want to take our place and want to become a church and a people of character, making a difference in the world with humility and with courage and compassion. But it all begins in prayer. Let me pray as we close.